welcome all. Good afternoon. As a scientific coordinator of the Center for Philosophy of Science of the University of Lisbon, I'm delighted to open this session of our permanent seminar, this time again on Zoom format. Today's speaker will be Dimitris Bolis. Dimitri did his PhD in medicine at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry and at the medical faculty of LMU Munich. He is now a postdoc researcher at our center and the FCT project INTERSELF, led by Anna Janica. And he works on the multiscale dynamics of social interaction and the self from empirical and philosophical angles. So this is what I copy from your presentation in our website. I want to thank you, Dimitri, for accepting our invitation to do this session. It is a great pleasure for us to have you here. And thanks and welcome. So, Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, João. I will say just a very quick words about the organization of this seminar today. First of all, we are recording the seminar. We will record only the part of the presentation, and we will stop when the Q&A session starts. Dimitris will have 40 minutes to speak, more or less, and then we can ask questions and hopefully have rich conversation about the presentation. So there's nothing else I have to say, just to thank Dimitris for accepting our invitation, and thanks you all for being here with us today. So please, Dimitris, go ahead. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, João and Sylvia, for inviting and for your very kind introduction. So as it was mentioned, I'm currently a postdoc at the Center for Philosophy of Science, and the work I will be presenting here is mainly accomplished in my former affiliation, the MPI of Psychiatry and LMU Munich. And most of this work has been realized during my PhD and my first postdoc there. So the title of the presentation is I Interact, Therefore I Am, Human Becoming in and Through Social Interaction, which is exactly the title of my PhD thesis. So for anybody who might be interested in digging into more details, feel free to search on the internet about the PDF. So our today's discussion will include four main sections. First, we'll start talking about the theoretical part of the work and the importance of others in our human becoming and being, and how interpersonal attunement, but also misattunement, might help or hinder at times our human development. Then we will also describe the empirical angles of our work, which is heavily based on what we call two-person or collective psychophysiology. And with that we mean the study of psychophysiological mechanisms at humans that are in interaction or in relationship with each other. So here we will discuss a first study on interpersonal attunement in real-time social interactions, and subsequently, going out of the lab, we will discuss how interpersonal attunement and misattunement might impact on real-life social relationships. And then we will discuss, we'll put these findings into a wider perspective, both scientifically, but also societally. And then we will conclude with our take-home message on whether and why social interaction might matter. So starting with the theoretical work, our work is based on two main pillars, namely the dialectical school of thinking, which is a philosophical school of thought going back to ancient societies such as in China or India or ancient Greece, and coming to modernity through so-called German and French schools of thought, but also other schools of thought. And then we will also be based on a more recent framework, more computational framework this time, which is called the Bayesian brain hypothesis. And we'll discuss how by merging these two main pillars, we attempt to achieve a more holistic but also fine-grained understanding of human becoming in action. So just to introduce the idea of the Bayesian brain, I will start with a very simple intuitive example. So let's imagine one lady in south of Greece, in Crete, where she's late to go to work and she doesn't have time to decide what to wear and whether she's carrying an umbrella with her. She relies on her prior experience. So the second day that the lady of our story attempts to go out without checking outside the window, she believes that the probability of raining might be slightly higher, but still she doesn't believe it would be so high to carry an umbrella. So this happens over multiple days, and you see how her probability beliefs updates every day after experiencing the so-called evidence of the real world. So after a week of getting wet because of the rain, she decides that she should take an umbrella with her because the probability of raining in her place at this time of the year is quite high. So the next year, she needs to travel to Japan and stay there for a while. So again, the same scenario, she tries to decide whether she takes an umbrella with her outside or not. And she heard from social rumors that the weather is good in the summer at this part of Japan. So she goes out, but she's still again unlucky. However, already in the second day there, she updates her beliefs to 90% of raining, so much faster. So why this might happen? One idea of this Bayesian brain framework, apart from the combination of beliefs, prior beliefs and current evidence to form so-called posterior beliefs, is the role of confidence of these beliefs. So here one can speculate that her less confident initial beliefs that was more a product of rumors than actual experience were easier to be updated based on more concrete real-world evidence. So here we see how these two critical quantities, such as the beliefs, probability beliefs, and confidence on beliefs, play a critical role in this framework when we try to understand real-world phenomena. So here I will not go into much detail, but what is crucial is that based on an apparently simple equation, namely the Bayes theorem, we can formally incorporate prior knowledge and combining with real-world evidence into computing statistical probabilities. And in this way, we can formulate and also test competing hypotheses about multiscale phenomena from the level of brain function. We can do that to the level of cognition, behavior, but also even sociocultural phenomena. However, one can wonder already that this sketch of how human cognition and behavior operates might notoriously resemble the Plato's cave allegory. So according to Plato's allegory, humans were trapped in a cave, chained there, and they experienced the real world, not by interacting with the world, but and not by even experiencing the real world objects, but just experiencing the shadows, the projections of the real world on the real world on the wall in front of them. So, of course, scientific evidence but also philosophical intuitions show us that this might not be true. So we and other organisms continuously interact with the world in order to survive and to make sense of it. So, and already this so-called predictive coding or Bayesian brain hypothesis framework picked up from the early years. and they enrich this view by also including action. So here, what is widely accepted in this framework, organisms' ultimate goal, like humans, is the minimization of prediction error, as we saw in our example, not by only learning and perception, as the lady in our story, but also through acting. So one can minimize prediction error either by updating their beliefs about the world to make them fit better in what they're experiencing, but also they can act on the world and change the world in order to conform to their prior beliefs. So and these actions, this process, we should not make sense of them as mechanistically, sequentially linked, but these are really inextricably linked in real life. So what dialectics, where dialectics come into place here, where we try in our work to situate such a powerful, in our views, computational account of human behavior into a more holistic framework, and that is the sociocultural and historical framework. So we, to do that, we lean on dialectics, which emphasizes the unity, inner contradiction, and movement, that is change of phenomena, in aiming to overcome traditionally thought dichotomies, such as the organisms and the environment, or the individual and the collective, or even a patient in a given culture. We try to place emphasis not only on intra-level processes, but also between-level processes across various timescales. So traditionally, one could argue that sciences, but also philosophy, have provided us with really important insights and about the mechanisms that underlying certain levels of analysis, from physical and biological processes to psychophysiological and more social phenomena. However, traditionally, science, in order to tackle specific phenomena, reduces them to single levels of description. What we suggest here is to rather try to implement paradigms based on modern technologies that could trigger potentially phenomena across various scales. And by this, we don't mean to devise the most complicated paradigms and experiments for empirical research, but rather simple paradigms can capture, we will argue, processes across different levels. And we will see later how this might be happened. Then in terms of, with regards to more theoretical, philosophical analysis, one based on these insights can formalize philosophical questions of many years, many centuries, such as the question of the self, what is the self and what is human becoming. Here, one can conceptualize this as a process, as a dynamic process, rather than an entity. And it's a process that might encompass both a dialectic of both internalization and externalization processes. And as externalization here, we mean the co-regulation of the outer world together with others, and especially the regulation of the social world. One here can think of both concrete, but also more non-physical processes, such as the law system, etc. And with internalization, one can think of the dynamical and active transformation of the environment into our bodily processes. So here, by combining old-standing Vygotskian thought, who have proclaimed that through others we become ourselves, one can discuss more concretely how this might happen within our bodies. So in this, one simple example to grasp this idea is that if we think how we interact with the physical world, even when we try to manipulate a tool or lift up a ball, we necessarily already embody implicitly the physics law. So if we want to keep a ball steady on the air, we already have implicitly adjusted our bodily forces and postures to equalize them with gravity forces. And the same can be argued for the social world. Exactly the same, in the same way, one can expand this view in order to make sense of how we co-regulate others and ourselves in order to achieve some dynamic balance between us and achieve our ultimate goal, which is survival. So in a nutshell, according to this so-called dialectical attunement view of human becoming, interpersonal statistical regularities on the collective level might shape multiscale hierarchical bodily models or structures on an individual level and vice versa. And this can play out and unfold in different time scales, starting from interoception and perception, going all the way to culture and phylogenesis. As we mentioned already, the Vygotskian approach is instrumental here and really inspiring, and in a nutshell can be described as through others we become ourselves. He lived around the beginning of 20th century, but already this school in psychology provided important insight about the primacy of social dimension and how many individual individual phenomena might stem through sociogenesis. However, in these years, unfortunately, the technology was not so advanced. And so we will argue here that with the means we have now, it's the ideal time of starting putting into the formal test this kind of ideas. So just to give an example of how our ideas align with the Vygotskian approach, I'll borrow an example of Vygotsky in one of his notebooks, and I will try to discuss how even symbolic functions, language, for example, development, might rely really on and be developed initially on an interpersonal level. So imagine a little baby that is very hungry and tries to reach out for food, but she cannot. So usually the caregiver will try to will understand the aim of this baby and will try to place the food nearer so that the baby can be fed. Let us think that this process simplistically happen days and days over again, and then the baby, but also the mother, comes into realization that when the baby reaches with a hand towards somewhere, and more specifically when reaches with extending the index finger, this might denote symbolically attention tracking to this specific object. Our common in our communication now pointing towards a product or object, sorry. And then we can even project this process into more evolutionary scales. And people like Tomasello have suggested that communication might emerge based on such kind of survival needs, for example, hunting and food gathering in ancient societies, which in turn were symbolized and transformed internally into our minds, and how this might be one route how our language developed as a first interpersonal tool, which then was internalized and now can be also used for internal purposes, such as private thought. And this one can wonder why it might be important in concrete and empirical research. Here I would like to discuss an example from psychiatry and neuroscience research, and see how this kind of ideas and taking seriously the importance of social interaction might help us understand certain phenomena more holistically. So here, one can argue that traditionally psychology studied individuals, even for questions such as social emotions or communication or autism in psychiatry. They were all largely studied in isolated individuals in a laboratory, and usually by comparing distinct groups, let's say autistic and non-autistic people. And then the differences found in brain function or behavior were usually attributed to the condition that was studied, for example, autism. So, however, here one can ask, what if we use diets in our experiments or groups of people? Then already it's intuitive that more real-time interactive processes can be tested, not only passive observation of stimuli. And this arguably could be crucial for certain conditions. So, for example, the second person perspective in neuroscience have suggested that even brain function is fundamentally different when we interact with others as opposed to just observe them. But this is not the only gain we have by extending our paradigms. Just by having two or more people in our experiments, one can see that already instead of having two groups of people, then we have at least three types of interacting groups of people. For example, in our case, neurotypical diets, autistic diets, and mixed diets. And here our hypothesis and suggestion has been that at least in certain levels of description, for example, the experiential level, the mixed diets might appear to perform less smoothly with each other. However, we can observe purely neurotypical diets or autistic diets to perform equally smooth. So we have anecdotal data, but also lately even some academic articles showing exactly this finding, where autistic people several times feel more comfortable when they interact with a random autistic person rather than a neurotypical person. Of course, this is on a statistical basis, and we can discuss later how there are also, of course, several exceptions to this rule. And then one can go way beyond such a simplistic approach to examining groups of people diverse in several traits across several dimensions, as, for example, a continuum of autistic traits. We don't need to classify necessarily always people according to specific conditions, we will argue here. But we can take into account also both individual mechanisms and needs, but also dyadic and group level functions. So to summarize our hypothesis, the dialectical misattunement hypothesis, we can think it as a cumulative intersubjective communicative gap on the collective level, which triggers and perpetuates increasing individual prediction and interaction styles, which then in turn feeds back to higher intersubjective gaps. So in a nutshell, interpersonal misattunement can be thought of as disturbances of the dynamic and reciprocal unfolding of an interaction across multiple time scales, resulting in increasingly divergent prediction and interaction styles and vice versa. So our hypothesis here holds clear predictions, so that the interactions within homogeneous diets might be expected to appear smoother compared to heterogeneous diets. And here we can see one operationalization of this premise. For example, we can think of homogeneity as a similarity of people in terms of autistic traits, and smoother interaction as a higher perceived friendship quality, for example. Our methodology, which we like to call two-person psychophysiology, will help us develop our experiments. And here First, I will start with our first study on interpersonal attunement in real-time social interactions. And as I mentioned already, our theoretical base here is the theories that places special emphasis on social interaction, such as second-person neuroscience, but also an activism in philosophy. So as we discussed before, according to such approaches, several processes, such as brain functions, might appear fundamentally different when two people interact with each other, as opposed to just passively observe others performing actions. So, and we will argue that if we don't include such interactive scenarios in our studies, we really miss this bidirectionality, which we find abundant in real life. So methodologically also we are heavily leaning on developing frameworks, so-called hyperscanning frameworks, where recording devices of brain and bodily function are used at the same time in at least two participants in order to understand not only the order and disorder of brain functions within a subject, but also across different subjects. So this is how our experimental setup seems. So I'll not go here into detail, but just one can observe that it's perfectly symmetrical across the two participants on the left and the right. And we record them in high resolution across different levels, from gaze, behavior, recording of facial expressions, and brain function, but also subjective evaluations of experience at the same time in high precision. So here you see how our setup looks like in real life, and how micro cameras on the screen and other recording modalities can track different physiological and behavioral properties. And our experiment here tackled the fundamental question, an old question, whether actually social interaction can really constitute, as Hannah de Janger and Ezequiel Di Paolo have already put it in an article, can constitute actually social cognition, how like our interaction with others and the environment can really constitute cognition, and that cognition is a process that goes beyond our skulls, grounded into the environment. So to operationalize this philosophical question, we devised a special, we enriched our setup with a special device, which will make capable our experiments to present stimuli to the other person, both in real time, like now through Zoom, but also with a delay. So people were not allowed to speak in our experiments. So we have perfectly equalized two conditions, the online social interaction and the offline social interaction. The only difference is that in the offline interaction, people didn't really interact with each other in real time, but they only observe a video of the other person during a past time period of their interaction. So in this case, one can think of this interaction as a one-way interaction. And if we wanted to see whether we will find any experiential or behavioral differences in the communication and behavior of our subjects. Because if social interaction doesn't bring something special qualitatively and quantitatively, then these two conditions should be exactly the same in our experiments. So this is how the little game the people played in our experiments. So we just asked them to identify what is different of the objects around them on the screen, around the other person, while they can observe the other person in the middle of the screen, moving their eyes. So their only interaction was gaze-based. So it's important to note here that we show them different objects like this on the right-hand side, but in the training phase, but in the real phase, we never saw any different object. So the only way to align with each other by chance was around 25% probability, because they had randomly to select around 4 possibilities. So what we observed in our experiments, you'll see first on a more experiential level, you see how here people are synchronized even in an emotional level, even if they cannot see the mouth of the other person during the real-time interaction. So you see how almost at the same time they perform same facial expression, but even the movements of the shoulders that they cannot see of the other person. And you see in the case 2, the same person 2 seconds later, when we break the interactive dynamics and they haven't realized, they're completely misattuned because they try to communicate but with each other, but the other person does not respond timely, so they completely lose of this interpersonal synchrony, which might help them make sense of the world, but also make them more sure about their own beliefs, as we will see. And here you see how we measure another level of analysis, also the gaze on the screen of the 2 persons. Red and green are the 2 persons, and blue is their coincidence on the space when they look at the same object. And you see how they coordinate their gaze by exploring the environment. And here, exactly as we predicted, the gaze coordination was the least strong during the pseudo condition, where we just shuffle participants with each other during the analysis. And it became slightly higher during the offline condition and even more higher in the online condition. And what is striking is that almost the same pattern was observed in their decision making. So whether they choose together, left, right, up or down, was a strong function of the condition, of the pseudo condition between randomly paired individuals that they really didn't play together. And then we have slightly elevated offline interpersonal attunement in decision making, and then the highest during the real-time social interaction. And these 2 levels of analysis were also significantly correlated, which is interesting to see how mechanistically this kind of levels of analysis might be connected. So how our gaze coordination impact on our decision making and vice versa. Now I will quickly pass into the second study, where we wondered about same phenomena, but on a more real world setting. So in this case, we did not perform an experiment in our lab, but we questioned what is the impact of interpersonal attunement in real life and social relationships. So in this case, we used so-called 2-person psychometrics, and we invited in our university groups of dyads of friends, and we measure their autistic traits, but also their satisfaction in terms of friendship between them. And what we interestingly observed is that what it predicted their friendship quality was not actually the autistic traits. So we had some tendency in terms of quality and autistic traits, but it was not significant statistically. And for the duration, we didn't have any association according to autistic traits. But what we observed when we studied the difference of autistic traits, that is the mismatch, is that the more similar people were, the more satisfied were about their friendship quality, and their friendship was longer. So of course, this is a correlational analysis, and we don't make any causal claim here. That's important to stress. But one speculation here is that to imagine of a process cycle that goes through higher interpersonal attunement to smoother social interaction, which might make our communication with the other person more rewarding, and that enhance our attraction about the other person, And this actually might increase our motivation to interact. And exactly because we interact more and in a more motivated manner, we are involved with others more, and the success of our interaction might be more higher, and which might feed back to higher satisfaction and interpersonal attunement in real life. So concluding our discussions, because we approached over the end of the talk, I'd just like to also refer to some limitations and future directions of our research line, now that we will also try to implement some of them with Anna Tsiaunika in Lisbon, but also other collaborators around the world, from going deeper into fine-grained mechanisms of social interaction and the self. For example, including hyperscanning experiments and more computational modeling of neuroscientific processes, to use more unmediated face-to-face interactions without the screens between people, to examine more heterogeneous population samples, for example, mixed gender or cross-cultural diets and groups, to tap into more scales of social interaction dynamics, from longitudinal tracking of two persons to across years, to more fine-grained along seconds of psychophysiological processes, and also perform some clinical studies, for example, on autistic populations or populations affected by depersonalization disorder. Other directions we are going is analyzing automatically the emotional and facial expression of people, and here to extend current analysis from one person to interpersonal synchrony across persons. As I said, also, we have already started tapping into hyperscanning studies where they will allow us to examine the mechanism of the brain in people that interacting. And we also started building sophisticated Bayesian computational models in order to tap into not only intrasubjective confidence and beliefs, but also intersubjective parameters of coupling. So one can also go deeper into this process by even distinguishing between exteroception and interoception in its subject, and see how this might help developing the sense of self and the body ownership and behavior production on individual, but also in collective behavior, which might be grounded and situated in the sociocultural environment. Finally, one here in a very recent paper, which is about to come out, we suggest into formalizing this kind of experimental paradigms by including multiple different hypotheses, for example, for autism, from our hypothesis of dialectical misattunement, but also other cognitive hypotheses for theory of mind or social motivation. Gather all the data of the different experiments across people, model these experiments in order to produce and project our processes on specific formal modeling spaces, and then with through machine learning, through dimensionality reduction algorithms to concatenate and form hyperspaces, where with machine learning we can identify automatically the crucial parameters and states that might define different conditions or processes of interaction, but also cognition. And then after identifying the most sensitive units of analysis, we can go back to our experimental design and formulate more precise paradigms, and repeating the same cycle into an imaginary helix. Also in the clinic, one can think of extending approaches or actually formalizing them, because actually psychiatry has embraced a multiscale approach already from the first years, as psychotherapy is an inherently social endeavor, but here, instead of putting the major focus on the so-called patient in the clinic, as happens regularly, we can also think of informing the general public, so that we don't need only to try to adjust prior beliefs and the action patterns of so-called patients, but also the social environment that might get more inclusive and alleviate at least part of the social difficulties that these people might face in our neurotypical world. But also one can place focus here also on the interpersonal medium that through which the interaction takes place, and this can happen across different contexts from pedagogy. For example, here one can focus not only on the autistic child, for example, and try to intervene behaviorally, but also target classmates and try to inform what is autism or what is other conditions, but also the interaction medium, which here we can use modern technologies, computers, to mediate communication or social robotics. And at the end, our aim might be how a dyad might be satisfied by the interaction and not and tuned and not specific individuals. And finally, one can also even think how laws and lawmaking can be adjusted in order to place emphasis not only on individual responsibility and bad making, but also more collective and sociocultural factors that might instigate certain types of behavior and embrace also collective intentionality and responsibility. So to conclude, because we already exceed our time for a couple of minutes, I would like to just conclude with last sentences of my thesis. So taken together, we have argued here that the social interaction does indeed matter. And in fact, we consider the question of social interaction as the fundamental philosophical question. And our argument here is a genuinely existential one. As one can argue that without social interaction, we cannot exist as humans. As we interact to live and we live to interact. So with this note, I would like to thank you all for your kind attention. And I would also like to thank all people in Munich that helped form these ideas and experiments, and especially my academic mentor, Leonard Gilbach, but also the people in Lisbon that already have helped advancing these ideas and integrating them, and especially Anna Sionika, which leads our current project. So I will be very happy to discuss with you any question you might have, and generally explore even new lines. Thank you very much.